Just 1 year ago, Max Verstappen looked untouchable in Formula One. Now, he is fighting just to stay relevant. So what changed? And why is nobody talking about the real problem? Because this is not just a bad weekend. It is not just one race where things did not go his way. What we are seeing right now is something deeper, something slower, and honestly, something a lot more dangerous. Max Verstappen is still one of the fastest drivers on the grid. That has not changed. His racecraft, his consistency, his ability to extract performance out of any car, all of that is still there. But suddenly, the results are not matching the driver anymore. And when that happens in Formula One, it usually means one thing. The problem is bigger than the driver. Red Bull, the team that looked miles ahead of everyone else not long ago, now looks vulnerable. Not just slightly off pace, not just struggling in certain conditions, but fundamentally out of sync with what the sport has become. And here is the part that should really make you pause. This did not happen overnight. This has been building, quietly, race after race, weekend after weekend, small cracks that most people ignored, until suddenly they became impossible to ignore. So the real question is not why Max Verstappen is struggling. The real question is, what exactly has he lost? Because once you understand that, everything about this 2026 season starts to make a lot more sense. But to see that clearly, you have to go back to when things still looked perfect. Because Max Verstappen did not just win in Formula One, he dominated it. We are talking about seasons where the gap between Red Bull and the rest of the field felt almost unfair. There were weekends where the race was effectively over before it even started. Qualifying lap, clean launch, control the pace, and disappear into the distance. That was the standard. At one point, Red Bull was winning over 80% of races in a season. Verstappen was not just beating his rivals, he was breaking them. Drivers like Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, Lando Norris, they were not just competing against him. They were chasing something they could not catch. And that dominance was not random. It was built on precision, strategy that rarely failed, communication that was almost perfect, and a car that responded exactly the way Verstappen needed it to. Everything was aligned. Now compare that to what we are seeing in 2026. The pace is inconsistent. Some weekends, the car looks competitive. The next, it drops off completely. Tire management, once a strength, now becomes unpredictable. Strategy calls that used to feel automatic now raise questions. And Verstappen himself, he still delivers moments of brilliance, but instead of controlling races, he is reacting to them. Instead of leading from the front, he is forced into fights he used to avoid entirely. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because in Formula One, when you go from controlling the race to reacting to it, you are no longer the one dictating the outcome. And this is where it stops being just a performance issue. Because drivers do not suddenly lose their edge like this. Not at his level. Not this quickly. Which means something else is happening behind the scenes. Something structural. Something that does not show up on highlight clips or quick race summaries. And if you have been watching closely, you can start to see the signs. Moments where communication breaks down over the radio. Situations where strategy feels delayed by just a few seconds. Decisions that used to be instinctive now feel hesitant. These are small details, easy to overlook if you are only watching the results. But in Formula One, small details are everything. They are the difference between controlling a race and chasing it, between winning comfortably and fighting just to stay in contention. And right now, those details are slipping. So here is the question you should be asking yourself. If Max Verstappen is still driving at an elite level, why does it feel like everything around him is starting to fall apart? And more importantly, what happens next if that trend continues? Because once you look deeper into the races this season, things get even more confusing. And that is where this story really starts to unfold. Max Verstappen did not just win in Formula One, he defined an era. There was a time when his name alone was enough to set expectations. You did not ask if he would be on the podium. You asked by how much he would win. That is how dominant he was. 3 world championships, dozens of race wins, and a level of consistency that made even the best drivers in the world look ordinary. But dominance like that creates something else. Expectations. And when those expectations are not met, even slightly, people notice. Now, those expectations are being challenged in a way we have not seen in years, because the numbers are starting to shift. Finishing positions that used to be first are now third, fourth, sometimes worse. Qualifying gaps that used to be measured in tenths are now closing. Rival teams are no longer hoping for mistakes. They are actively outpacing Red Bull in certain conditions. And that changes how every race feels. Instead of inevitability, there is uncertainty. Instead of control, there is pressure. And pressure in Formula One does something very specific. It exposes weaknesses, not just in the car, not just in the driver, but in the entire system. Because Formula One is not an individual sport. It is a network. Engineers, strategists, communication, data, timing. Every piece has to work perfectly. And when even one part starts to fall behind, the whole system feels it. That is what makes this moment so important. Because what we are seeing is not just the driver having a bad stretch. We are seeing a system that used to be perfect starting to break down. And the scary part? It is happening at the exact moment the sport itself is changing. New regulations, new competitive balance, new teams rising. Everything is shifting. And Red Bull, the team that once defined the standard, is suddenly trying to catch up to it. So if you are watching this and thinking this is just a temporary dip, ask yourself this: what if it is not? What if this is the beginning of something bigger? Because if that is true, then what happens next will not just define this season. It could define the rest of Max Verstappen's career. And if you are still here, trying to figure this out, you are not the only one. Because this is exactly the moment where things stop being obvious and start getting interesting. At first, it looked like just one bad race. Then it happened again and again. And suddenly, a pattern started to form. Look at the qualifying sessions first. There was a time when Max Verstappen could put half a second on the field without even looking like he was pushing. Clean lap, perfect rotation, early throttle, gone. That was the standard. Now the margins are different. Instead of leading by 3/10, He is sometimes trailing by 1 or 2, and not because of a mistake, not because of traffic, just pure pace. That alone should raise a red flag. But it gets worse when you move into race conditions, because race pace used to be his strongest weapon: tire management, consistency, long stint dominance. That was where Verstappen separated himself from everyone else. Now, you start seeing stints where the tires fall off earlier than expected. You see moments where he cannot extend a gap. You see him stuck behind cars he would have passed within 3 laps last year. So what changed? Is it the car balance? Is it the setup window? Or is it something deeper that no one is openly talking about? And then you look at strategy. This is where things become even more confusing. Red Bull used to operate like a machine. Pit stops timed to perfection. Strategy calls that felt inevitable. They were not reacting to races. They were controlling them. Now you see hesitation. A delayed pit call by 2 laps. A tire choice that does not match track evolution. A moment where Verstappen is asking questions on the radio instead of receiving clear answers. That difference might sound small. It is not. In Formula One, 2 laps can be the difference between an undercut that wins you the race and one that traps you in traffic for the next 20 minutes. And when those small mistakes start to stack, the outcome changes completely. But here is the part that most people are missing: the communication. Because if you listen closely to the team radio, something feels off. There used to be a rhythm between Verstappen and his race engineer. Short, precise, almost instinctive. He would ask for information, and it would come immediately. Exactly what he needed. No more, no less. Now there are pauses. Moments where the response is slightly delayed. Moments where the answer is not as clear. Moments where Verstappen sounds frustrated, not because he is losing, but because something does not feel aligned. And that brings us to the biggest change of all: the absence of someone who used to hold everything together. Because when a system works perfectly for years, you do not notice the individuals inside it. But when one of those individuals leaves, you feel it immediately. And in this case, that absence is not subtle. It shows up in decision-making. It shows up in timing. It shows up in the way races unfold from the pit wall to the cockpit. So now you have 3 layers of the same problem. The car is no longer dominant. The strategy is no longer flawless. The communication is no longer seamless. And when all 3 start slipping at the same time, you are not dealing with a simple issue anymore. You are looking at something systemic. But here is the part that makes this even more complicated. Because even with all of this, Max Verstappen is still performing at an elite level. He is still extracting lap time where there should not be lap time. He is still making moves that remind you exactly why he dominated this sport. Which creates a contradiction. If the driver is still elite and the results are dropping, then the problem cannot be the driver. So where is it coming from? Because the more you look at this, the less it feels like a simple performance issue. And the deeper you go, the more it starts to point in a direction that most people are not ready to accept. What if the problem is not new? What if it has been there all along, hidden behind dominance? Because what if the very system that made Max Verstappen unbeatable is now the same system holding him back? What if the problem is not Max Verstappen at all? What if the very system that made him unbeatable is now working against him. Because when you zoom out, the timing of this collapse is not random. It lines up almost perfectly with one thing: the shift into the 2026 era. And that changes everything. Because Formula One in 2026 is not the same sport that Red Bull mastered. New regulations have changed how cars behave. Power units, aerodynamics, energy deployment, everything is different. Teams that adapted faster are suddenly competitive. Teams that relied on previous strengths are struggling to translate them. Think of it like this. Imagine a team that spent years mastering one style of play. Every move, every decision, every system built around that style. They become unbeatable. Then the rules change. Suddenly, the skills that made them dominant are not as effective. The instincts they rely on no longer produce the same results. And the systems built around those instincts start to break. That is what this looks like. Red Bull did not suddenly become bad. They became misaligned. And in a sport where everything is measured in milliseconds, misalignment is enough to cost you everything. So the real issue is not that Red Bull lost speed. It is that the entire structure that created that speed is no longer optimized for the current game. And Max Verstappen is stuck inside it. He is still driving at the same level, still pushing the same limits. But now he is doing it in a system that does not respond the way it used to. That is why the results feel inconsistent. That is why the performance feels unpredictable, because the feedback loop between driver, car, and team is no longer perfectly synchronized. And once that loop breaks, even slightly, the entire performance chain starts to fall apart. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because if this is really a system problem, then it is not something you fix in one race. It is not even something you fix in one season. It requires rebuilding how the team operates, how the car is developed, how decisions are made under pressure. And that takes time. Time that Verstappen might not be willing to wait. So here is the question. If the system cannot adapt fast enough, what does Max Verstappen do? Does he stay and try to rebuild it? Or does he look for a system that already works? Before you answer that, think about this, because the next part might completely change how you see this situation. Right now, here is what I want to know from you. Do you think this is just a temporary dip? Or are we actually watching the beginning of Red Bull losing control of Formula One? Because, depending on your answer, the future of Max Verstappen could look very different. And once you connect all of this, one final question remains. Now here is where things get real. Because when you actually look at the data, it tells a completely different story than what most people think. Start with raw performance comparisons. Across multiple race weekends this season, the gap between Red Bull and teams like McLaren and Ferrari has not just closed. In certain conditions, it has flipped entirely. High-speed corners, where Red Bull used to dominate, now look balanced. Slow speed traction zones, where Verstappen could once create separation, now expose limitations. And on tracks where tire degradation decides everything, the advantage is no longer guaranteed. But here is the key detail. When you isolate Verstappen's individual lap times, especially during clean air stints, he is still operating at an elite level. There are laps where he is matching or even outperforming rivals in sectors where the car should not allow it. Micro corrections, mid-corner, late braking adjustments, perfect throttle modulation out of exits. Those are not the signs of a declining driver. Those are the signs of a driver compensating. And that is a completely different situation. Because when a driver starts compensating for the car instead of working with it, the ceiling of performance drops immediately. You can fight for positions. You can minimize losses, but you cannot dominate. Now add another layer: team feedback. Throughout the season, Verstappen has made subtle but consistent comments about the car. Not dramatic complaints, not emotional reactions, just precise observations. Balance not responding the same way. Setup changes not translating into predictable gains. The car feeling disconnected in certain phases of the lap. That word matters. Disconnected. Because in Formula One, connection between driver and car is everything. It is what allows instinct to take over. It is what turns reaction time into performance. And when that connection weakens, even slightly, everything becomes harder. Now combine that with results. You start seeing races where Verstappen finishes just outside the top positions, despite extracting everything possible. You see weekends where strategy tries to compensate for pace that simply is not there. And suddenly, the pattern becomes clear. The driver is still operating at a championship level. The system around him is not. Here is another angle most people overlook: comparison within the team. If the issue was purely Verstappen, you would expect internal gaps to shrink, teammates getting closer, performance equalizing. But that is not what is happening. Instead, you often see the opposite. Verstappen still pulling away internally, still outperforming expectations relative to the same machinery, which reinforces one conclusion. This is not a driver problem, this is a system limitation. And once you accept that, everything starts to line up. The inconsistent race results, the strategic hesitation, the communication gaps, the frustration that sounds controlled but unmistakable. All of it points to one thing: a system that no longer matches the demands of the current Formula One landscape. Now here is where it becomes bigger than just one team. Because Formula One is entering a new competitive phase, teams like McLaren have built systems around adaptability. Ferrari is refining execution at a level they struggled with before. Even midfield teams are closing gaps through smarter development cycles. The sport is evolving, and Red Bull, the team that once defined the evolution, is now reacting to it. That is a dangerous position to be in, especially for a driver like Max Verstappen. Because elite drivers do not just want to compete, they want control. They want to know that when they deliver a perfect lap, the system around them will convert it into a result. Right now, that guarantee does not exist. So here is the reality. Max Verstappen is not getting worse. The environment around him is no longer giving him the tools to be what he already is. And in Formula One, that difference changes careers. Because drivers at this level do not wait forever. They evaluate, they adapt, and sometimes they move. Which brings us to the final question. What happens next? Because if Red Bull cannot realign with the direction of the sport, Verstappen will eventually face a decision. stay and rebuild, or leave and win. And history tells us how these decisions usually go. Great drivers go where the system works. So no, Max Verstappen is not suddenly worse. He is just stuck in a system that no longer works. And that might be the most dangerous situation of his entire career. Because this is not just about one season. This is about the direction of Formula One itself. A shift in power. A reset of dominance. A moment where the driver who defined an era has to decide if he is willing to redefine himself or find a place where he does not have to. And that is where this story stops being about performance and starts becoming about legacy. Because if this continues, we are not just watching a tough season. We are watching the beginning of the biggest shift in Formula One in years. So now it comes down to you. Do you think Red Bull can fix this before it is too late? Or are we watching the first signs of Max Verstappen walking away from the system that made him a champion? Because the next move he makes might not just change his career. It might change Formula One itself. And if you want to see how this story unfolds and what happens next in this shift, make sure you are here for the next one.